all of you. Sunday morning, not easy to get Bangaloreans up on Sunday morning, but appreciate your skipping your brunches or whatever and coming here. Thank you to BIC for hosting us. I can see a lot of the BIC stalwarts in the room. And of course, thanks to Penguin for publishing the book and to the authors who contributed their time. And of course, the speakers, two of whom have flown from Delhi. We keep the Delhi people on this side, Bangaloreans on this side. So when I was asked initially to do this, I thought it's a relatively easy task. All I have to do is to get a few people to write a few essays, and there we go. It's turned out to be much more complicated. It took a long time with lots of delays, etc. And then came the legal reviews. Current situation being what it is, many of the articles had to be legally reviewed several times. One of the articles got pulled. But anyway, here we are. It's come out finally. And interestingly enough, the delay in some ways has turned out to be beneficial because there could not have been a better time for the book to come out than now, because foreign policy, which is normally in some kind of inside pages of the newspapers, is now front page every day. So I think it's very, very topical. I have to do a little bit of promotion of the book before we get into the actual substance of the discussion. I think, it's partly promotional, it's partly true. I think, and of course, we have stalwarts in the foreign policy space. I feel often like an interloper into this conversation. But I think and I had to obviously review a lot of the foreign policy books as we were working on this. I'd say that one of the unique things is that it's kind of centered the question of the relationship between domestic actions and reality and how we position ourselves internationally. So I think that's something we've done. Of course, it's the writers. So, just to give you examples, Jyoti Ghosh has done a piece on the economy, because we are often talking about how our economy is doing amazingly well, etc. And so she's really kind of questioned the underlying fundamentals of that. We have two people writing on the environmental question and how climate change, how we treat our environment, then connects up into national progress. Then, of course, how you position yourself nationally affects international standing as well. So I think there's many other pieces. The crown jewel, it's a kind of who's who in foreign policy. If you look at the book, and Higginbotham's kindly has put up a stall at the back, and we can do some signing for those of you who like autographed books. But I think within the all-star cast, the crown jewel is a piece by former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And I must say that, to be honest, I've read Manmohan Singh's work over the years, and always had slightly mixed views about it. But I think what he did for this book is quite exceptional. I think it's an exceptional piece. So if you don't read anything else, please do read this piece. And many thanks to Shyam Saran also, who had him in conversation to kind of get him to talk about this. I think that my only regret in this book that he passed away before he could see it, but that's the way it worked out. So the book's also doing well. I thought nobody reads these kind of nerdy foreign policy books, but it's actually selling very, very well. So the way we want to just structure as we get into the substance of it now, the way we want to structure it would be slightly different from the usual structure, which is that we have 30 minutes for the panelists to speak. Then we want to take it to the audience for 30 minutes to ask questions. And then we close with a 20-25 minutes of kind of closing remarks. And the closing part, I've requested the panelists to focus it more on the future, because otherwise we could get very caught up with the present and the crisis we're dealing with, etc. We will actually talk about the crisis. We do want to, get into that at the very outset, so we don't get stuck in that as we proceed. The current crisis. Interestingly, the foreign policy, typically when you talk to foreign policy people, there's a certain language which you know that foreign policy people use when they speak, and typically what they'd say that it's a very slow-moving thing, that governments come and go, but foreign policy remains intact, etc. All that's gone upside down now, thanks to a certain Donald Trump, who is electrified. If not anything else, he has electrified international affairs and policy, for better or for worse. So the theme of today's conversation is, as you know, has Trump commandeered India's foreign policy? So I thought we'll start with a quick pulse of the room. How many of you feel that he has commandeered India's foreign policy? Raise your hand, please. Okay, how many of you feel that he is not? No, very few. So lots of maybes in the room. Okay, that's great. So let's get into the Iran West Asia discussion first. I've requested all the panelists to give their initial inputs on this. The general understanding is we'll try and keep our interventions short and sharp, and then to keep it more conversational. So I think the Iran story, is hitting home now, because a lot of these other things, it's like video games, right? We're watching on television, etc. But this thing is starting to hit us now. I'm sure if we do another show of hands of how many of you are friends, relatives in the Gulf region, and of course, what's going to happen to the dosas in the restaurants, etc. We'll have a lot of views on that. I'm sure the questions will raise issues as well. But it's an unprovoked and unlawful assault on one of our oldest civilizational friends, and there's been an assassination of the supreme leader of the country and his family, and it goes on. So international humanitarian laws have been violated, schools have been attacked, the cadets in the ship. I mean, so I'm sure you're all familiar with all the issues around it, and it took forever for us to sign even the condolence book, and we sent somebody very low level. And it's been going on in a sense even since Gaza, since the attack on Gaza. We've had this silence, from our side. And I think for the first time, we are starting to, more questions are being asked. At least in my sense is that for the first time, even those who are otherwise very supportive of whatever this government did are starting to ask questions. But what I want to ask the panel, sorry to give a long kind of introduction, but what I want to ask the panel is, the foreign policy community, of course, they're asking questions, but often we're being told it's inexplicable, the silence. That's kind of, I think, a Shiv Shankar Meninism, that it's inexplicable. But is it really? I mean, that's my question. Is the silence inexplicable? Because you can take two or three angles to this, right? One is, given, there's a bully on both sides. So, bullies cow down to bullies. So is that what's happened? And of course, the economic might of the US being what it is, and our relationship with Israel, you could say that, it's a very reasonable stand. It's awkward at the moment, but we can't take that risk. The trade-off is too big. Or you take the kind of, in a sense, the Congress party position, if Salman, I can say so, which Rahul Gandhi is constantly saying, that they're compromised. Whether it's Epstein or, Adani SEC case in the US, or, there's a long list of reasons why the current government would be compromised in the US context. So I wanted to get from you as to, I mean, of course, and business dealings with Israel as well. There's all sorts of very murky things which happen as well, which I'm not so sure it happens only in this government, but it's kind of heightened. We feel it much more. The Adani Ambani issue keeps coming up. So I wanted to ask, and I'll start with you, because Sindoor, you were also in the delegation, Salman. So Sindoor also, Trump 100 times he says, I fixed it. But, we don't want to say anything. The Deputy Secretary of State shows up at Raisina Dialogue and says, we're not going to make the same mistake with India, which we made with China. We're going to put you down sooner, but we are silent. Why?
Well, I think what we see today, whether it's the relationship with the United States of America, with Russia, the silence that you speak of, etc., is not something that's happened overnight. It's not something we've been forced into because of events that have happened in West Asia. I think there was a conscious decision to depart from foreign policy as we understood foreign policy in this country, on which I believe that there was a widespread consensus, and that consensus cut across political divides, political parties, and I often think of the manner in which Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had sent the then leader of opposition, the future Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, to be the head of delegation when we went to Geneva on the Kashmir issue. And that was not just one-off thing. That was the standard manner in which we dealt with foreign policy in this country at that time. Now, there's been a complete departure from that. It's only for the first time in Operation Sindoor delegations that there was an outreach to people from other parties, MPs largely, and there were some more people. I guess I must have been the only one who was not in Parliament who was invited. But clearly, there wasn't a consensual position that was prepared for the delegations. We just had to take it or leave it. And I was, in fact, somewhat unhappy that finally I had to go, because what was being said abroad was completely different from the debate that was happening in the country. And I couldn't possibly let down my side as far as the debate was concerned. But I'm only saying this to the extent that this wasn't the reflection of an attempt to develop consensus once again, even if it was limited to Operation Sindoor and Pakistan, etc. And I think the consensus being given up was a conscious choice. Consensus being given up based on an understanding of domestic politics that obviously we disagree with. And therefore, did the domestic politics influence our giving up consensus on foreign policy is a big question. And I think that's the way it worked. It wasn't that the foreign policy then broke the consensus in our country. The second point is that forget the consensus consultation. There is no communication and consultation between the government and the opposition, which was the standard practice in all the previous prime ministers. There was a standard practice that whatever you did, you projected a single voice across the world. And that was a common voice of the opposition and the ruling party. Now, that doesn't happen. There's no consultation. There's no communication. You don't even debate in parliament, so you don't know exactly what the government is thinking and what it's doing. And the government takes a position that they indicate that they don't want to share. Now, come to the events that have now happened. The events that have now happened, we were ill prepared for those events by jettisoning the foreign policy structure that we had. We didn't put in place a foreign policy structure that we could proudly say is a replacement, which is better than what there was. Now, you know, the present foreign minister has been very critical of India's participation and initiation of the NAM movement. He quotes people saying that this was a great mistake that was made. We should have made better choices at the time when we decided to follow the NAM movement. Now, given that they've tried to formulate things like multipolarity, multi-alignment, etc., frankly, as far as we are concerned, it was a simple transactional policy framework in which you just chose from case to case, do we react, we don't react. And suddenly, both the European conflict, Ukraine and Russia, and then Gaza, and thereafter, after Gaza, the West Asian conflict, has put them in a position where they don't really have anything to say. You have to choose between friends. You have to choose between people that you can't let go completely, and to then do something and say something that would be acceptable to both sides. Now, either we don't have the courage to do that, or we don't have the gumption to do that, or we are just very ill-prepared. What are friends for if you can't tell friends that they are doing something wrong? And particularly something wrong that they're doing is impacting India. Russia, Ukraine, it's impacting India. What has happened now with Iran and Israel is impacting India. What happened in Gaza and Palestine is impacting India. Now, if we can't even tell our friends that something is going wrong and we believe it's wrong, and that wrong is hurting us as well, if we can't even tell our friends that, then what are friendships for? And lastly, I think it's very important, I think the former Foreign Secretary will tell us more about this. There has been a significant place of values and morality in Indian foreign policy. pragmatism is important, self-interest is important, but I think there's a difference between self-interest and enlightened self-interest. And this distinction has been lost as far as the present government is concerned.
Thank you so much. So the good thing about this panel is we have a political person who's a law justice minister and foreign minister. Then we have Nirupama, who's from the kind of foreign service, so has no political allegiances. You've seen governments come and go, and they all say what they have to say. And Suhasini, in a sense, from a media world, she's got an independent perspective as well. So Nirupama, can I ask you as to what is your take on what's happening and the U.S. relationship, because your chapter is also focusing on that in the book. I mean, are we getting a little bit too carried away because these things come and go? Trump is not going to be there forever. I mean, are we overreacting? This is not going to last forever either. These things happen. So, what is your sense? Will relationship with the US come back to normal? Because all the elite in this country, many of them, their bodies are here, but their heart is in the US anyway. So, can we afford to risk elite relationships as well?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for making me a part of this discussion. I must say that my contributing a chapter to this book began a few years ago, and things changed phenomenally from that first contribution. In fact, I had to rewrite the chapter once again, and now I find reading it that so much has been overtaken by events. But however, this is part of our tryst, I guess. I was looking at the dictionary definition of a tryst, which is essentially a romantic assignment between lovers, which is not exactly how you would explain our major relationships today. Having said that, since we are talking about our approach to the world as things unfold at the moment, I'm reminded of that very British term, curate's egg. It's good in parts and bad in others. And I speak as an independent person now. I've been long retired from the Foreign Service, so I don't hesitate to speak my views, and I do ventilate them on social media, as you know, quite often. So looking at the current nature of developments as they're unfolding in the Middle East, I mean, I don't think any one of us, when writing this book, expected things to happen the way they are today. And when you look at the US-Israel attack on Iran, I agree with you. Our relationship with Iran is a civilizational relationship. And addressing Mr. Khurshid's reference to values and morality in foreign policy, the current government has not hesitated, stressing, emphasizing that we are a Vishwa Guru, that we stand for civilizational values and for strategic autonomy. Even as we may have criticized the historic basis of non-alignment, we still have pinned our colors to the mast of strategic autonomy. And from that, of course, stems this reference to India is only on its own side, whatever happens, that we stand for multipolarity. But multipolarity, let me also caution, is a very messy multipolarity today. This is essentially a kind of reiteration, or shall I say, a new iteration of a jungle book when it comes to international politics today. And countries like India are basically charting their own navigational path, which is why I said in a recent essay, response to an essay in Foreign Affairs, that India is a liminal power. India exists in a liminal space. It is waiting to come out of that space. It is still defining what its best interests are, which again would lead you to the logic of having values, having certain foundational principles when it comes to addressing our relations with the world. So what is happening in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. So that was adequately demonstrated when the Iranian ship, the IRIS Dana, was sunk off the coast of Sri Lanka on the 4th of March. Of course, our government said, it had happened, it was unfortunate, that it was bad luck for the Dana. which perhaps is a rather, a summing up of the event, which is rather perhaps short of exactly what transpired in terms of, the suffering, the humanitarian aspect of the tragedy, which I think always was something that India spoke about when it came to the neighborhood. Suhasini refers to the ring of fire being that ideally we should have the ring of fire replaced by a circle of trust. And that circle of trust, when you draw it, extends far beyond our own, maritime waters, as it were, our own, coastal periphery. It extends to the neighborhood because India, being the largest country in the region, has always spoken about being the guardian of the Indian Ocean. And I'm talking of the current government speaking on those terms. So when that tragedy happened, I think we could have afforded to say a little more. Why do I say that? Not just from the humanitarian aspect and our constant talk of being the net security provider and the first responder when it comes to tragedies. Think of the tsunami, December 2004. We were the first responders, even much, much before the US Navy engaged in humanitarian operations. So when that tragedy happened off the coast of Sri Lanka, I think we could have spoken a little more about it, deplored the tragic aspect of what had happened. More than 100 sailors, Iranian sailors, human beings, going down right to the bottom of the deep. And I spoke about the fact that the US, before it entered the Second World War in December 1941, witnessed a similar tragedy, the sinking of the Reuben James. The Reuben James had about 150 sailors on board. 115 perished in that torpedo attack by a German U-2 boat in the Atlantic in early 1941. So the US has witnessed this kind of tragedy. And in fact, those of us who are interested in music will recall the very famous Woody Guthrie song, Remember the Reuben James. And I think we need to remember the IRS Dana when it comes to what is happening in the Middle East today. So the Indian Ocean is a lifeline for us. It's a lifeline in terms of our trade, maritime domain awareness, which we keep talking about. It is infrastructure. Think of the Cholas extending their empire across the Bay of Bengal, their reach to the Malacca Strait, to Sri Vijaya. All that happened through the ocean. The ocean is our life. We are a maritime country as much as we are a continental presence in South Asia. So for all these reasons, I think the war doesn't stay in the Middle East. The third point I'd like to mention is when it comes to our relationship with the United States, which remains the sole superpower. All you may say about China, the fact is the US capacity to deploy strength and to demonstrate it across borders, across continents is very real, and it has been demonstrated today as the war goes on in a region very close to us. So our relationship with the United States, I believe, and this goes beyond, maybe it's a postscript to my chapter, goes beyond sentiment. I don't think we can romanticize this relationship anymore. It's not, a defining partnership in the sense we defined it perhaps last year or before Trump 2.0 came like a sock in our stomachs, literally. We all have experienced it. So today, I wrote about this yesterday, the American gaze on India is far more unsentimental than it ever was. And it's demonstrated by the Trumpian tariffs. He sees tariffs as the panacea for all ills, but it goes beyond that. It actually inflicts pain on people. It causes damage. It does harm to our economies. And then you have technology SARS, and this administration is very much, I think, governed, or at least close or aligned to the views of people like Peter Thiel, for instance. And Peter Thiel spoke in a podcast in 2023 to Alan Hewitt. I think it was Alan Hewitt. He said, India is a terribly messed up place. And he said that India is horribly corrupt. And these are views that filter into the administration. And I'm sure they have the ear of Trump. And people like Thiel believe that unless a country is on the frontiers of innovation, technology-wise, like China is, you don't count for very much. And India is seen as a service provider. It's seen as a potential competitor to China. Its presence in the Indo-Pacific is important for the Americans, but it is defined and expressed and in a sense explained in terms that do not suggest that India is a partner of equal terms with the United States. And you referred to, I think Mr. Khurshid referred to Landau, Deputy Secretary Landau's remarks last week at the Raisina Dialogue, which again said, that India cannot expect the kind of treatment that the US gave China after China entered the WTO, thanks to US largesse. And China was literally cradled by the United States in its rise. And that's not going to happen with India. So these are home truths. And then finally, if you'll permit me, I think our involvement with Israel, I've constantly said, firstly, our origin stories are very different. Israel's origin story is very different from India's origin story. Secondly, I think this deification of Israel as a country that is able to deal with its neighborhood, that is able to control its enemies, that is able to use the vengeance is mine approach when it comes to its adversaries cannot apply to India, because we are a continental country. We're not a country of 9 million like Israel. Israel's population doesn't even equal half of Bangalore's. And when you look at 1.3 billion people in India and the challenges that a government faces in terms of national consolidation and national development, everything is so different from Israel. So I think there's an emotional substitution I see when it comes to looking at how Israel, look at our media. Sorry, Suhasini, this doesn't apply to you. But there is a lot of, almost everybody in the media seems to be a fangirl or fanboy of Israel. So I
was just looking at Atiq because he's responsible for some of Bangalore's development now. So if you would have been in Israel, Atiq, you would have been the prime minister, because we are Bangalore's bigger than Israel. But before I give it to Suhasini, Nirupama, can I ask you, so why are we, because we have all this, chest thumping, Vishwaguru, all of that, Akhand Bharat, then what happened suddenly? Why are we silent? I mean, because I know you're not in the service anymore, but everything we're hearing is that even the people in the service are not able to understand this. So what is it? Akhand Bharat and this crony capitalism has overtaken national interest, or what is happening?
No, I believe that we've gone through certain whiplash diplomacy with the Americans in the last few months, or almost a year now. And I think that has left obviously some trauma. And I've constantly said, this is not a time for us to run for cover just because that happened, or to be, influenced by the fact that we have a strategic partnership with Israel. It's very important for us from the defense and strategy and security point of view. All that is fine. But when it comes to looking at the principles that have governed our approach to the world, our tryst with the world, I think that we cannot afford to jettison or abandon those principles and sink them like the Dana was sunk across the coast of Sri Lanka. So I hope I've made myself clear.
Thank you. So Suhasini, let's come to our neighborhood, which is what your chapter is about. What is astonishing is that it seems like we're left with no friends. Even the ones who are the closest to us, we seem to have alienated them. In the last decade, we've had 2 serious altercations with Pakistan, military altercations, one with China. and the people of Nepal after the blockade, and the people of Bangladesh after CA, NRC, and all of the harboring Hasina here, and all of these countries have had uprisings, revolutions, mostly youth-led, and the sentiment against India is not good. So, I mean, if you ask many of those places, the way Trump is seen globally, we are seen in a similar way, right, inside South Asia, that we're just using our might, we get away with whatever we want. I mean, historically, there's a kind of big brother issue with India anyway, because we're much bigger, etc. But it seems to have really, become much more serious this time around, even in Sri Lanka. And somehow we have Adani ports and all kind of Adani coal supply in Bangladesh over invoiced allegedly. So, what is your assessment of what's happening in the neighborhood? And of course, it has a bearing on West Asia as well.
Certainly. And I've been trained very well never to disagree with one's editors, but I do have to say that I consider myself part Bangalorean. Grew up many summers here, went, even though I didn't understand a lot of it, to a cinema called Navrang Talkies, which I don't think anybody in this generation would know about. So, the truth is, when you speak about India's neighborhood, the truth is, and Ambassador Rao very kindly referred to my idea that we see our neighborhood as a circle of fire, as a ring of fire around India. So if you were to make, the map of India, or Bharat Mata as you'd like, it seems that she is encircled by neighbors that are always in some kind of trouble or the other. And the average Indian too sees it as a kind of, a distraction or something that we don't have to regard unless it's causing us problems. And this includes, countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and not to mention Pakistan and Bangladesh, with which we have at various points had adversarial relationships. So it's never been an easy relationship. It has always been up to the government of the day to come into power, make the right noises, and then manage challenge after challenge. So in that sense, I would say the present government made those right noises at the beginning. They spoke about neighborhood first. They spoke about SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which no longer seems to exist in practice today. But then there were a series of mistakes, and this is what I argue in the book, that perhaps have made it even more tense with the neighborhood. And some of it comes through even in this war in West Asia today. I think the first was the idea that even if India is the first amongst equals, if it sees itself as the first amongst equals in this neighborhood of 8 countries, asserting that seldom ever gets you the response you want. So the idea that this new India, that new Bharat, with a muscular approach, would be able to manage neighbors in a way that others had not been able to do, I think that was the first place where we've had issues. And I can give you any number of examples: the problems with the Rajapakses, the problems with the Maldives, twice, in fact, over the similar situations we have seen with Nepal that really backfired. And that's a part of my chapter. The second, I would say, has been the idea that India is an exemplar of certain values that we've spoken about, is moving away from those. So even if our neighbors never, and I've actually had the good fortune, because I was a journalist at the time when SAARC was a thing. So I've had the good fortune of visiting each of our neighbors under some SAARC pretext, a SAARC summit, or another meeting. And I can say that in every one of our neighbors, there is a deep sense of admiration for what India had become. And it was equally a sense of admiration for values that they necessarily did not have. So there was secularism and pluralism in India was seen with a certain amount of admiration, even in a very Islamic Pakistan. And of course, in Bangladesh. And remember that each of our neighbors do have a majoritarian population. It's not as if any of them have this kind of equal 50-50 sort of breakup. Each of them has one very dominant religion. And the fact that India remained secular for 70 years, 80 years, has been a point of admiration. So there has been a question mark over that. I still believe that India is a deeply secular country, that we are a country that cherishes pluralism. But I do think that questions have been asked now about the nature of our pluralism. Questions have been asked about our democracy. Again, a point of admiration. So when you had, military dictatorships or other kind of quasi-authoritarians in the neighborhood, and even if they were very popular in their countries, they still look to India. They still look to our democratic processes, our electoral processes with a matter of pride. There's a question mark over there. So, I've listed them out. There are certain things about India as the exemplar that have been questioned. I think the third, and this one cannot just blame what's happening inside India, but what's happening in the rest of the world. In the last decade and a half, the US-China contestation has come into South Asia, however you like it. Of course, we have focused very much on what China is doing in South Asia, and you really just need to look at some of the figures. If you were to look at 2008 compared to 2018, and I don't go further because COVID had a certain amount of disruptive effect because China really closed its boundaries. But if you just compared 2000 to 2018 and looked at figures for aid, trade, students, tourists, business, investment, those five, you would see that China was slowly replacing India as the predominant power in each of our neighbors. Maybe Bhutan is an exception. Nepal was certainly the biggest exception for a while because its land access was all through India. That has changed in the last few years, particularly after the blockade that they believe India forced on them. So you've seen the China side, and everybody is well aware of it. Now we're seeing the American side, and that's where this whole West Asian war or Gulf War 3.0, however you want to see it, comes in, because that moment in which a US submarine torpedoed an Iranian ship in the Indian Ocean, not in our waters, international waters, off Sri Lanka, EZ in a sense, it told us three things. It told us, one, we don't need to coordinate with you. So all these years of the Quad partnership matter not. Maritime domain awareness that we keep talking about. Yes, we were taken by surprise, but also we were taken by surprise because this was our partner, this was our friend that did it. The second thing that moment kind of told you was that this is not going to be an America that cares about the international tenets, norms. I'm not even talking about the rule of law because that's a bit dodgy, but a ship that's coming back from a naval exercise is shot. There is no attempt made to rescue those on board. Of course, India went in, and before them, the Sri Lankan Navy was able to rescue them. Very admirable of us to have done. The third, and this is where we come back to this very thoughtfully chosen subject on Trump commandeering Indian foreign policy, and one would not like to say yes. To be honest, I know that so many of you in the room have put your hands up, but I'm sure as Indians, we have not been happy about thinking that that could perhaps be the case. And I can tell you as a journalist, he may be commandeering foreign policy or not, he's commandeering my assignment desk. Because I wake up now every morning, and instead of trying to figure out what my story of the day is, I just go to see what has Mr. Trump said overnight, so I know what my story is. To come to that, I think this is what is the message that has gone out. It's a message that we must try and counter. Because you have called it silence. The problem is not the silence. The problem is we could live with not saying anything about Russia's invasion in Ukraine, perhaps get through Israel's terrible bombardment of Gaza with silence. Here we have spoken. We have spoken only to criticize Iran's actions against the Gulf, and not one word about the US and Israel's actions, whether it was the bombing of Khamenei, whether it was the terrible civilian casualties in Iran and in Lebanon, and whether it has been on this ship. The fact that we have not said a single word. I think those are the three messages that came from this one US decision which I think we have to engage with more closely.
Thank you, Suhasini. I just want to tell Salman one thing, that this multi-alignment term, Dr. Shashi Tharoor claims that he created it. So he has made that claim in the book as well. So I guess bringing this terminology, we also take some responsibility for that.
Thank you for the opportunity, and hello, everyone. You've actually clipped my thought by saying keep it short. It's very difficult to do that, but I'll try. You see, I want to go on this the Ambani-Adani story, which has been spinning around. I was a part of the government delegation led by the cabinet secretary in 91, 92, when we were trying to get US investments into India, and I had the good fortune of meeting Sudhakar Rao sir in one of those trips, and of course, ma'am. Nobody was interested in India. And we were trying very hard to get them into the power sector from where I come. And then we did this brilliant thing in 98 of not honoring our guarantee, which we had given to the lenders internationally. And I still remember I used to go every year to the United States, and I still remember guys saying, hey guys, you don't even honor your constitutional guarantee. They were talking about the privy purses. How do you expect us to come to your country? That's one. So now what has happened, I'm not an expert, I'm just talking as a bystander. Looking at the investments that flew in the last few years, 10, 15 years, 20 years, what has happened is the lenders are not comfortable lending to governments. They're comfortable lending to companies. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but I do see these companies building infrastructure. That infrastructure is being used by us, whether it's ports, airports, whatever. I don't want to go to one particular company, but that's being done for us. And we as citizens and consumers are enjoying it. That's point one. Point two is I see a very important thing that you said in the beginning. This is a civilizational clash at one level, because you're trying to push American values, which I still don't understand what they are. Maybe the experts do, where you put the Red Indians into reservations and they talk about democracy, etc., etc.
So you have to get to a question. Otherwise,
I'm coming to that.
Please.
The question is basically, I'm just sharing this so you know in what context I'm coming. Sure. So they are trying to push their values, which they themselves are very confused about. And very, very beautifully said by some of the speakers that, we have had values in the past and we are sort of moving away from it. My question is, where do we go in the future? As citizens of this country, where are we going? This clash is very deep. It has religion, it has culture, the whole works. Where do you see it going?
So you think of this as a kind of a crusade. And so we have a kind of Islamic and a Hindu civilization. And but Christians are attacking, or which side are they on? Okay, whichever. We'll come to this crusade question. Or please don't. There's someone in the back raised their hand. Abraham. Okay, very good.
Except that we do have Israel bombing certain Maronite Christian villages in Lebanon, so it becomes a bit...
Let's get one more question then.
I have a very short question. Ambassador Nirupama, as well as Suhasini, basically. There's a huge deficit of trust with China, the Chinese people, in India, and I think by and large in the world. There's now a deficit of trust with US. Where do we go?
Good.
And what do you say about it? What do you say about this deficit of trust with China as a country, as its people?
I'd come back to more questions in a minute. We'll get a response from the panel on the civilizational clash question and the trust deficit question. I just wanted to mention that Manmohan Singh's take on the China issue is actually very refreshing. I found it very refreshing, where he says that, when he was a prime minister, the conversations he was having with the Chinese is that Asia is big enough for India and China. China is not a threat to India. India is not a threat to China. In fact, it's a win-win, which is kind of Chinese language, win-win, and he's used it as well. But please, who's wanting to take on the... Salman, you want to go first on?
Well, on the issue of trust, frankly, it's a basic ingredient of relationships. And when there is lack of trust for a variety of reasons, now you have to start building, and that's what we call confidence building measures, that you have to take some steps by which you can revive trust. Without trust, there is very little that can happen. But now, if and when this war ends, the conflict in West Asia ends, there will have to be very meticulous and very determined work by whoever is prepared to take the initiative. And obviously, those who've been involved have to be engaged in that, to start taking baby steps to build that trust again. But for speaking for India and just reflecting on some of the things that have been that have been sort of generally mentioned, we will not be able to work on trust in the world if we can't work on trust within our own country. I think that's very critical. It's important that we revive trust in our own country. We want people not to bully other people in the world. Well, we'll have to be sure that we don't bully anyone here. And there are enough complicated challenges for us within the country. And therefore, if we make some progress within the country on these issues, we will be a better place to be an exemplar once again to the world. I think the world is screaming for a person to stand up and say, I will be counted towards a process that will bring peace again. And unfortunately, that voice is not being heard. I mean, it's not coming from anywhere as yet.
Nirupama?
Well, I think that trust is the coping stone of any relationship, whether human or diplomatic or between nations. I think after Galwan, June 2020, the refrain from our side was that trust had been completely destroyed as a result of that clash in which we lost 20 lives of our soldiers. So that entered the lexicon of the relationship in a much more defined and much more looming way than it ever had before. Now we've made, in this new geometry of relations that we are trying to craft in the region, in the last few months, there has been a certain thaw in our relations with China, and we are engaging with them much more, and there has been a resumption of leadership level contact also. Whether this points to the resumption of trust, one cannot say, because the relationship with China has many complexities to it. It is, of course, defined by our differences over the border, the war of 1962, the historical memory. You know, talking of historical memory, there is a historical memory that we have accumulated in this country, let me say as a senior citizen, which is all about grievance. And grievance, naturally, we have obviously reason to remember the war of 1962, but how can we learn from that experience, which is what I wrote about in The Fractured Himalaya? How do we learn from that, and how do we not repeat the past when it comes to the future? You spoke of future, you speak of 2047. What is it that awaits us in our relationship with China? I can't really say. When it comes to the United States, we all know the kind of relationship that we had with the United States during the Cold War, you know, the John Foster Dulles days, and even Kissinger in 1971, and the Nixon-Kissinger conversations speak volumes about the way they looked at India. In the last 2.5 decades, we have taken steps to improve that relationship. And there was obviously effort made by both sides to bridge the divide and to introduce more trust into the relationship. And then you have Mr. Donald Trump in his second incarnation, storming onto the stage and saying nothing really matters. We will define everything in terms of leverage, in terms of transaction. And as I said earlier, very unsentimental. So where is the trust? Obviously, trust has been denuded now as a result of this. And I think the noise that you hear from the people here in this country reflect very much the fact that the US is certainly, America as they call it, is certainly not the most favored destination for most Indians today. I think there are many lessons to be learned from that. And finally, about civilizational clashes, when you think of what is happening in Iran, and when you think of the historical connections between India and Iran, we in Bangalore are part of the Deccan. The Deccan was so influenced by Persian culture and people who came from Persia and influenced the lifestyle, the language, There was this two-way, traffic between India and Iran, which speaks of a civilizational, if I wouldn't put it as confluence, but certainly a civilizational engagement and a certain civilizational synchronization in so many ways. So it's unfortunate when you think of historic sites in Shiraz and Isfahan being bombed in this war, and you think of poets like Hafiz and Sadi, whose poetry is loved in this country till this day. So I don't believe, I mean, we have a certain historical memory of Islam in this country, and I know that sometimes the popular refrain is to think about all the damage that, quote unquote, came with it. But I look at it a little differently. I look at it as this India that we all love and belong to is really a composite of so many influences. And what makes us, as Kathleen Raine, the British poet, said once, the place of every arrival is because so many people arrived in this country and made it theirs and influenced us. And we, in turn, while assimilating those influences, also gave to them. So, which is why, I think of greater India in those concepts. The old maps of the 18th century speak of India within the Ganges and India beyond the Ganges. And my version of greater India is India beyond the Ganges, which influenced through its civilizational ethos and its values so many others.
So, Suhasini, the sort of Huntington thesis, in a sense, the question is about, are we back to the clash of civilizations? But I mean, to me, it feels, the extreme forms, like, Bibi represents an extreme version of what Israel stands for. Our regime here is an extreme form of what we stand for. Trump is another extreme character. So, and the extremes, they actually all agree with each other. It's beyond Abrahamic, beyond crusades. They actually share it. Like their views on women, for example. They have a shared view on all these things. So, is it, kind of, are we beyond that clash of civilization?
I'm just the journalist here to find you. So I'm not sure about the theories of these things. But I will say this, that I think the clash of civilizations, even when it was used by Samuel Huntington, was a way of reverse engineering ill thought out actions. And it is easy for us to say, well, there's nothing we can do. We can't, from birth itself, congenitally, we are doomed to these differences between us, when actually those differences are not there on the ground. And I will say this. I will say that in this particular war, for example, we do see the framing now of a, India, US, Israel coming together, or even just the US-Israel framing of the reasons for attacking Iran. But at the same time, we have seen three things. One, we have seen a speech by Mr. Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, who essentially made the case in Munich a few weeks ago, not of a civilizational US, Israel, India, or any other country kind of coalition, but essentially of Anglo-Saxons on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. He pitched to the Europe of Christian faith, very specifically, and said, we can work this out together. He was not even considering Jewish immigrants in his speech. He spoke only about the German immigrant, Christian German immigrant who came and worked hard in American bakeries or whatever it is he said. He spoke again and again about the idea that everybody else was the problem, but that actually this, and I can get into a discourse about what he said there. The second thing we have heard is from Mr. Rubio again, but also from the American administration, which essentially makes the case that they didn't see, Pentagon has said this in Congress, they didn't see a credible threat from Iran at the time. In fact, the US was in talks with Iran at that time. So were those talks not genuine, or, where did this credible threat come in from? And Mr. Rubio went on to say, not only was there no threat, but we thought there would be a threat if they were attacked by somebody else. So the idea that a country would retaliate if it was, it's a no-brainer. But the fact that the US could not explain what is the threat that made them attack Iran at that time, The third came from the Israeli foreign minister who spoke at the Raisina dialogue. And when he was asked, so Prime Minister Modi was in Israel. Did you hide from him that you had planned this attack, which is probably what did happen, but he didn't accept it? Or did, essentially, was it a case of keeping it from him not knowing, or him knowing and still having this trip, going to Israel, speaking at the Knesset, saying that we stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel in the moment and beyond, said all of this, and then this attack happened, and was he in some way complicit in it? And Mr. Sar said, no. In fact, we weren't sure that we were going to have that target at that time. We just decided that because Mr. Khamenei was sitting over there with all these people, that this was the time to attack, and we went ahead with it, spoke to the Americans, went ahead. There is no civilizational hue to any of this. What we're seeing is a reverse engineering of that civilizational part. And to your question, sir, I think it's been answered on the question of trust. I'll only come to it from my perspective, which is that, yes, we have been literally, hammered on the head for the last 6 years. From 2020 to 2026, India in particular has taken a real battering. I mean, hats off to a government that has to still deal with each of these challenges. But from COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israel attacks on October 7th, and the way Israel went to devastate Gaza after that and really devastated what you were talking about, some of our business plans for the IMEC corridor, followed by, in between this, China's aggressions on the LAC, the killing of the first Indian soldiers to die at the LAC in a clash like that. Followed by then Israel, so there was Israel and Gaza, and then there was the India-Pakistan war. Now, in all of this, we come up with the latest challenge, which is 1 year of Mr. Trump's tariffs and his policy really hitting us economically, and now from the beginning of 2026, first Venezuela and then Iran. So I think there's no question that we have lost our trust in a lot of the world. And we do seem, in fact, I wrote in a recent piece that we shouldn't now start feeling like a Vishwa victim, because, it is, everybody seems to be, giving us problems. The answer lies actually in where we are. Unless India becomes a stakeholder, a commander, if you like, of a South Asian process with an all-of-region outlook, we are going to consistently come against the same challenges, whether it is of energy, whether it is of remittances, whether it is of education, outsourcing, the AI technology challenges, as well as that one for security. Unless we come back to our region and realize that every other part of the world has done its groupings geographically. The EU is tighter than ever before. Mercosur is getting there. We see it in Africa. African Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually, now there are sub-regional free trade agreements in Africa that are doing very well. We stayed out of the RCEP, but do we have a choice now to say that we aren't even part of our own regional frameworks? I think that would be a real loss.
So we'll come back to this, Sri. I'll get some more questions. Hari, then we've got a lady right here. When we start here, then we can go. Then I saw some more hands at the back. If you can keep your questions short, we can get more questions.
Yeah. So before this war on Iran, the US government waged a war on immigrants. And what I want to know is, do we have a foreign policy at all in this regard, or Indian citizens who leave the country don't merit a foreign policy?
No, thank you. That's a good question. Actually, Salman, I wanted you to also come in on the diaspora issue a little bit, because they're kind of interrelated questions. Hari, you wanted?
Salil, first one is a response to your first question, right?
Okay.
Are there maybes? In my view, it's not Trump, but it's actually Mr. Netanyahu who is commanding, because the US foreign policy and the US Act is completely dominated by him and the Zionist lobby. And that, I think, would be the right question, hence it was not a maybe, right? The next is a question to Mr. Khurshid and Nirupama. You talked of what do you call, in terms of our foreign policies not being consensual, right? and you also talked of when it comes to self-interest and best interest. If you look at the question is there going to be a reversal of that? The question is based on, we are seeing increasing autocracies in democracies. And essentially, autocracies lead to poor next level leaders. You see that in the US, you see that in India, right? And essentially, if it is autocracies, there is no question of consensual foreign policy, and it will always have a short-term view, hence tactical. So hence my view is, this is across the globe. You're seeing it in the US, you're seeing it in India, you're seeing it everywhere because of the emergence of autocracies and democracies and many other countries. When do you see ever a reversal of this? And an idea of cooperation and not just competition.
Good, thank you. There's some more hands. I don't know how you'll do this, Sandhya, but somehow you've got experience. So I don't have to make the choice, you make it.
Yeah. Hi. China's foreign policy for the last 20 years, I would say. I mean, it's really bolstered by the fact that they have invested heavily in infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure inside. So, for example, a lot of their foreign policy in Africa is based on export of solar batteries, things like this, right?
Maybe you can stand up. If you don't
Okay.
mind.
Yeah, better. And the same thing outside, right? Like a lot of the infrastructure, I mean, ports, railways, etc., has been cornerstone of their foreign policy in a lot of developing countries. Where do you think India's, I mean, what is the silver bullet that we have, according to you, going forward that we should heavily invest in, which could probably lead to good foreign policy organically as opposed to
Thank you. Got it,
diplomatically?
got it. Sandhya, one more maybe we can take. I don't know where Sandhya is. Okay.
Thank you. I would like to hear a little bit more about not the analysis, but what is the reaction from within the country. Because do you feel that the government that we have elected has maybe lost the capability or has sort of thrown it out of the window in terms of its capability and its power to negotiate on behalf of the people of this country? The US trade deal has nothing to do with 1.5 billion people, frankly. It has nothing to do with farmers and so on and so forth. But anyway, the point is, we at this point are with the government in various contexts, even in terms of our democracy. When you talk about diplomacy, you want to see it as a democracy. And you want to say, how should diplomacy play a role in positioning India? For our sakes, for the people. This doesn't seem to be happening, but I'd love to hear your comment on it. But more so, not the comment, but where do we go in terms of a response from people? Because we seem to be these spectators watching this happen. And somehow it is not within our power, but I don't believe that to be the case. And if it is, we need to move beyond it. And I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. So, Sandhya, if you don't mind, I'll close with this. You have one more? Okay. Yeah, okay. By the way, my brother-in-law is sitting here. If I don't give him the mic, I'll have trouble at home. The young lady first. Okay. Young lady.
Good morning, everyone. Do you not think there are too many striking similarities between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi? And why is world becoming so regressive with the rise of ideas like religious nationalism, suppression of minority, genocide in Palestine and Sudan, and rolling back of women's rights? If you look at the current state of Afghanistan and Sudan, and why are you so attracted to right-wing extremism on social media? That's my question.
No, thank you. I think that's many people have asked similar questions, so hopefully you'll get.
Thank you. Thank you. As someone who has taught India's foreign policy, I remember we used to refer to public diplomacy quite a bit. My question is, if the subtitle of your book and what we're also discussing here is Manifesto for India's foreign policy for the future. My direct question would be, what role do you think public diplomacy will have to play in this manifesto for India's foreign policy?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so public diplomacy and kind of engagement with the public. Yeah, I think few people have asked similar. So, Salman, why don't you go with the? I just wanted to say one thing in that context. The question was about, this immigration question, the way in which we treat migrants, and I was wanting to connect you with the diaspora issue. But one of the things which I didn't realize, and I discovered as I was looking into this subject, is that India now has is a country with the third largest number of undocumented workers in the US, over 700,000. And in the first month, I think, of Trump's coming to power in 2025, he put 100 or so of them on a plane to Amritsar in shackles. So I'm just wondering whether that's another reason why we're compromised, because if they start doing more of that, we're not going to look good.
Well, you've made that the issue and that question more complicated. I think what is emerging from these questions is the issue of the democratic deficit. There is a major problem in the world. It's the two clear examples are India and the United States of America. Internal conflict for a variety of reasons. Call them legitimate, illegitimate, etc. But certainly they have a historical foundation. Many of our first generation leaders in this country had expected, hoped, and worked for moving beyond the historical conflict, etc. And that's what we saw in the first years after partition and independence, that terrible things happen, but we believed it was important to go beyond those terrible things. And many, many people agreed to go beyond and forget the past. Forget the past to the extent of not holding it on as a grievance, but learning from it and then moving on to a better past. Now, unfortunately, it seems that we are reversing ourselves back to a position where the grievances are being revived and we are beginning to rewrite and rediscover history. And this is happening not in our country alone, but it's happening in the United States as well. So ultimately, it's a test of democracy. And I can't believe that the world will jettison democracy because there are deficits of democracy that we are today encountering. I believe a cycle, the cycle will move forward, that the attempt of extreme conservatives to bring about restricted democracy or if you like, a distorted democracy would finally return to a movement of democracy. Now, in an interesting thing that one sees today about Iran, whatever be the projections that the Americans are making, etc., but there is somebody from the regime that was displaced by the Iranian Revolution who is actually putting forward himself as a solution. So it's interesting that you're going back 20 years, the problem has become the solution, or at least is proposing himself as a solution. Now, there's too little data available to be able to say something, but I think we are living in an age where beyond the clash of civilizations, we seem to have a clash of problems and solutions, problems becoming solutions and solutions becoming problems. And democracy will have to resolve it. Diplomacy will then follow.
Thank you so much. Why don't you go, sir?
Since many of the questions were about this idea that we're turning towards authoritarianism, how are we going to be represented better? As a result, we're not as efficient, perhaps, as we thought we were. I think, we have to remember we're not alone. Nearly 10 years ago, there was this Princeton professor who wrote a book called What is Populism?, in which he looked at 20 countries around the world which were democracies and were moving towards authoritarianism. And in that, he looked at what are the common features of all of them. And I would urge you to read the book. It's a very thin monograph, really, on the various things that he saw in all these authoritarian leaning democracies. The first was the desire So all of this, the xenophobia is a part of it. The very harsh rhetoric between religions or regions or ethnicities, all of that is a part of it. But essentially, he picked up on one very important thing. He said, in our new world where everybody has an opinion and no two opinions really are the same, what a leader whose populist needs is not a majority. He needs to find the minority within the majority that has a sense of grievance. And his point was that when you find that minority within the majority that has a sense of grievance, you essentially appropriate that grievance to then be the representative of the whole majority. It's a very complicated, but actually it's an argument that would work across each of these countries that you're looking at. And he was not even talking about the US or India or any of the more modern versions of this. He said, therefore, the hatred or mistrust of the outsider, the other, is a part of that. It has to be part of it. The grievance has to be a part of it. The idea that you will, that all your foreign policy, and this is the point I'm trying to make, all your foreign policy is essentially meant to not further your domestic interests, because obviously I know government is going to survive if it doesn't look at what is the domestic angle to any foreign policy question, but that it is to drive your domestic popularity. And therefore, I think at some point we're all going to start studying populist foreign policy as a certain brand, because we're seeing it now. There's no point saying this is not foreign policy. This is foreign policy. This what you referred to when you said the diaspora. The idea that we weaponized our diaspora for about 10 years before I think we stopped doing it. The lovely thing, by the way, about any democracy like India, like the US, is we always do the right thing after we've tried all the wrong things. But the truth is this idea that we could weaponize and politicize the Indian diaspora worldwide in order to build a kind of force multiplier for ourselves, that idea has now gone away. And as a result, you don't see as many of those big rallies that we used to do where the leader, I'll stop here. I remember going to the Wembley Stadium rally where David Cameron stood side by side with our prime minister, and then he spoke to this audience of Indian diaspora, and he said, "You're also lucky to have this man as your prime minister." And the audience was stunned because David Cameron was the prime minister. So I think that has also hit its limits. But you're right. In this war, I have been asked again and again, 9 million Indians in the Gulf. Very few thousands in Iran. So obviously we are going to be with the Gulf. It doesn't work like that, because your diaspora, the needs of your Indian citizens abroad will always be an immediate concern, but it is by no means the largest concerns of foreign policy.
Can I ask you on this, Suhasini? Because these Gulf states, they're all group of royal families, right? And the Iranian regime came to power by dislodging the royalty. So are they concerned themselves about their countries or about themselves? Because they don't represent their people either, right?
I want to add one thing. The ones that are run by kings or sheikhs or whatever are actually because also the US has very specifically targeted all the Arab nationalist republics. So Iraq, Syria, Libya. Iran arguably became a theocracy, so it kind of made its own space over there, although they did overthrow the rule. So yes, there are a lot of vested interests in keeping that position. But these monarchies have been smart. They've been dynamic. They have moved along. They have modernized their countries. I think over here, what you're seeing is a very interesting moment, and it could go either way. So we should watch what's happening in the Gulf very closely. Because remember, despite being attacked day after day, not one single Gulf country has attacked Iran. And we have to think about why that is. We hear these stories come out every once, and now UAE has targeted Iranian oil, and then the UAE denies it. Then they said, I think the Saudis had done something, and the Saudis denied it. They even said Turkey has done something. Turkey denied it. Why is that happening? And I think it is because the mood on the street in this particular case, and I would say the mood, by the way, in India as well, length and breadth, that I mean, I have not been length and breadth, but whoever I have spoken to, and I think our government is realizing that. There's a discomfort with what the US and Israel have done. The killing of this 86-year-old man with his family. There's a discomfort with the idea that we say Atithi Devo Bhava, but the moment our Atithi leaves our waters and gets killed, we can't even say, we're really sorry. And there is a certain amount of a David versus Goliath idea that a country that many, at least in the West, had thought would surrender within a day or two has stuck it out for a couple of weeks.
Nirupama?
I just I thought I'd address the questions everybody had asked. On the issue of immigration and visas, now the Trump administration has definitely become far more selective, far more, put down barriers for the easy movement of even professionals. Forget the illegal immigrants. So that's a new dimension to the relationship and a new chapter that we have, have basically to come to terms with, which leads me again to this whole concept of how we built a whole industry around services, about movement of such professionals. A whole India story was built on that over the last 3 decades. And that, in a sense, today, I think that's a moment for us of comeuppance in a certain way. We have to really understand what the future holds in that regard. When it comes to foreign policy and its connections with domestic policy, I think India is in very many ways a huge echo chamber today. And many times I think the direction of what we say on foreign policy is addressed to a domestic audience. And, it reverberates in that echo chamber. And in a sense, there's happiness all around about, what stands we've taken, the way we've told off countries. Especially, I think, with Pakistan, there is an ongoing kind of conversation or lack of it on these issues. The other thing is, in my own experience, especially when it comes to neighbors and when it comes to Pakistan particularly, is that foreign policy is conducted in an amphitheater. It's very gladiatorial. And, that's the way it is. It's not just with this government, but even with previous governments. I'm very taken with the fact that a lot of people I speak to, not people who are connected essentially with foreign affairs, have taken to geopolitics in a big way. I think geopolitics has become the hashtag, the buzzword, the favorite go-to term for many of us. And I don't know to what extent the understanding of it has permeated in the population. Then the final point on foreign policy, because it's so dictated by the domestic environment, I am, as somebody who's spent long years in the business, I'm, saddened by the degree of insularity within India today. The inward-looking nature of our politics, our national debate, our media approaches to issues. So that I think, when we talk of deglobalization today or reglobalization today, I think we also have to take a serious note of this insularity that is accompanying it. I think on values concerning foreign policy, your book mentions Samvidhan. And I think we must mention that word in our conversation today. It is so important for that to be the rallying point, not religion, but Samvidhan. Public diplomacy, I think India is very visible, but it's not entirely legible to the world. And I think that is the challenge that faces all public diplomacy professionals in this country today. Somebody raised the issue of projects and how China builds roads and delivers on various development aid. I think, again, lessons to be learned from that, because if there is a missing gene in our DNA, it is implementation. Implementation. It's not enough to sign, glorified agreements and memoranda of understanding, but the implementation. And I think that is something where we all fall short. And I think we bureaucrats, we diplomats belong to the same gene pool. We're no different from the rest of the country. So I think the speed of delivery, we set up a development partnership administration within MEA a few years ago, but I don't really know if things have changed. And when you go to the neighborhood, the rest of South Asia, and I've also visited all the nations. Take Sri Lanka, a country to which I go quite often. The way the Chinese choose their projects, they're very visible. They have a high profile. They may not cost that much, but you build a stadium in the middle of the city. You build an auditorium, a beautiful theater where, national events take place. And everybody then, thinks of China. So I think we have to learn. I think we have to think a little more strategically on these issues. If there was one thing I desire for us Indians, I would say we have to inculcate a much more methodical way of thinking about these issues, because we have so many ideas floating around in our heads. But I think we have to be able to focus, to align, to direct them in a way that is more effective. The young lady spoke about, genocide and the way things are going from bad to worse. And I'd like to remind her of this line from King Lear. There's that famous line, it's never the worst when you can say it's the worst. So today, we are saying things are worse and getting worse. Yeah, but there are worse situations than this. And maybe we wouldn't even be able to say these are worse. So at least thank God that we're able to talk about the fact that it is the worst of what we've seen. But maybe there's worse times ahead, and let's try and avoid that, I would say. And finally, coming back to South Asia and what Suhasini said, I always say South Asia is an integer, and we've somehow forgotten that. We've forgotten the romance and the poetry of the Grand Trunk Road. I think we really have to.
Thank you, Nirupama. So we're kind of wrapping up now, and I wanted each of you to sort of say in just one or two sentences, what would you do between now to 2047? What would be, and Salman is very relevant for you, obviously, because what would the Congress Party do if you actually are back in power? Because it's not very clear. One of the things I mentioned in my book, in my chapter as well, is that the opposition's kind of clarity on foreign policy is also, it's a bit hazy, because I don't really know if there's somebody sitting and thinking about it and putting this forward. So what would be different, let's say, if India Alliance came to power in 2029, between now and 2047?
Well, I think it's one thing is clear that when I say we, the Congress Party, but not just the Congress Party, a large number of people, many people who are foreign policy experts, who are professionals, people who followed foreign policy, people who are who actively involve themselves in public discourse and debates, etc., have grown up on a particular ethos of foreign policy. And I believe that we would want to go back to that ethos, but obviously with modifications. And those modifications can be talked about provided we have some kind of stability in the world. Today, for me to say this is what we would do might be out of date next week. So, but I think the broad structure we agree will have to be reflective of what we've grown up on, and a new version of non-alignment, very dramatically reworked version of non-alignment, where the spirit of non-alignment and the values of non-alignment will prevail. But obviously, because of a changed world, particularly the blocks having disappeared and so on, it'll have to be a very different kind of non-aligned world. But I think one thing is very clear, that much as we pride ourselves in having got to the high table of the world, we will and should remain the voice of the global South. I think that's very, very critical. We pay lip service to it from time to time, but I think for the near future, for foreseeable future, our place remains firmly in the South for a variety of reasons, not just economic, but for a variety of reasons. And I hope that we will continue to be the voice of global South.
Thank you so much. So, Suhasini, we are being pushed into the arms of the South again because we got pushed out. The bromance and the chemistry with Trump has ended. So now we're rushing back to Global South, NAM, BRICS, we're going to chair it. Is that part of your 2047 recommendation, in short?
In short, I don't think non-alignment, or I actually put all of these in the, multipolarity, multi-alignment, strategic autonomy. These are all ways of saying that India, the cheese stands alone, in a sense, or in our neighborhood. India is not non-aligned because, or cares about strategic autonomy because it could, because of any other reason, but it's geography. Our geography will always involve us looking at our challenges, the continental challenges, the maritime challenges, the fact that we have our toughest two neighbors are 3,000 kilometers on one side, 3,000 kilometers on the other side. We can't do away with it. Beyond them, beyond China and Pakistan, we can keep going all the way to Moscow. We will not find a single country in this region which is in the American hemisphere or in the Western idea of the hierarchy of the world. In our continental sphere, we will always see a certain ability to coalesce in dealing perhaps with China, as we have in the Quad. But eventually, none of that is going to help us fight the challenges to the north. The short answer to all of this is that India's geography essentially decides that it will be politically always somewhere in the center. And therefore, I would say that as we go forward, we have to accept that. We have to then try and strengthen ourselves within this geography. And within this geography will also include Pakistan, but it will include all of South Asia. We need to find ways to go back to it. I find it amazing that the last time I went to Pakistan was because the External Affairs Minister of India went to Pakistan to attend an SCO meeting, which is not even run by our region. It's the SCO is more or less, headed or led in a sense by Russia and China. They're the ones that started it. And to me, it seems amazing that my leaders cannot restart the SARC because we cannot travel to Pakistan, but we can do it at the behest of some other extra-regional power. So we need to regain that. I think I have not lost hope. I think it's the only way forward, and I do think we'll get there.
We have to end with a hopeful note. Nirupama, we wanted to talk more about the EU, UK. We have no time for all of that. We keep signing all these trade deals. Everything is opaque. We don't know what's in any trade deal anyway, but apparently it's a great big achievement that we've signed these trade deals. I mean, what's your closing hopeful statements? Because that your last one about worse could get worse left me a little bit thinking, oh my God, can it get worse?
Well, I'd first like to speak a little about strategic autonomy since we all addressed it.
Very short though.
Strategic autonomy, to my mind, means independence of judgment, being able to retain a certain moral compass when it comes to developments surrounding us and that affect us in terms of our future. So I would perhaps, of course, while good bureaucrats always advocate habits of caution when it comes to events, I would always say keep the moral compass intact and retain your independence of judgment because optics matter also. Now, I understand that our diplomacy has become quite performative, perhaps looking at optics, but I think optics in the fundamental sense is how people judge you. And I think Suhasini spoke about meeting people when she goes everywhere and the mood in the street being what it is, that we have a certain sympathy for the underdog. And we are concerned about the attacks by Israel and the United States, obviously pushed by Netanyahu in many ways, who seems to be the power behind the throne, literally, and seeing everything dissolve before our very eyes, all the definitions we had. And coming to trade deals, I think India has moved quite resolutely, and it's a good thing that we were able to conclude trade deals, particularly with the EU. It's seen as a very a deal that not only affords us better terms in in terms of the regulatory climate, in terms of standards, in terms of entry for into the European market. From all those points of view, it's really quite a deal, and has been spoken of in very lofty terms by both countries, and quite legitimately, I think. So doing these deals, increasing integration, looking at regional compacts, all that is good for India. And but I would like to go back to the South Asian context and say it starts at home. It does start with South Asia. We're a big country. We can afford to think big also.
Thank you, Nirupama. So I want to kind of close the conversation. I just want to tell Suhasini from a Bangalore perspective that we have produced another prime minister in Nepal. I don't know if you're aware that Balen Shah studied in Bangalore.
The rap singer.
Bangalore is bigger than you can imagine. I mean, Akhilesh Yadav is also a product of Karnataka. So, we are producing all these engineers who I hope he is going to structurally engineer Nepal differently now. But thank you all.
I'm also a product of Bangalore. I grew up here. I went to college here.
Now, a lot of people claiming, Suhasini, I'm going to check your antecedents about Navrang Theatre and Rajajinagar. But just to close, I think that, we need another 4 hours to have this conversation, right? So we had to keep it tight. And I think one of the interesting things is that, when you look at these authoritarian, I call them elected authoritarians. That's a new model because they're actually coming through the ballot, but basically they're dictators. So if you look at the main characters, cast of characters in this, so you have Trump, you have Bibi, Netanyahu, you have Modi, you have MBS in Saudi Arabia. I mean, what do you expect? If you have 4, testosterone-driven, chest-thumping leaders, all men, something is going to happen which is not very nice, right? I mean, that's kind of, we forget the personalities and the individuals involved when we talk about grand policy. So this, a foreign policy which is driven by constant self-promotion, getting awards, walking down red carpets, and it's very easy to deal with these things. So everyone's figured this out. You just need to do this and you can get away with it. And so finally you go through the trade deals and everything else, you'll be back to few companies benefiting. Nothing is clear as to who's really behind it. And then, of course, if you have nothing else, you have Akhand Bharat and Vishwaguru. So thank you very much. Thanks.